The moment I walked through the doors of Confluence Station, something in the room changed. I did not feel it the way most people describe a change. Not a shift in the air, not a ripple of sound, not the kind of dramatic stillness you read about in novels. It was subtler than that. It was the way a forest goes quiet when something new enters it. Not loud, not obvious, just a very precise, very deliberate silence that lasted no more than 3 seconds before conversation resumed around me. But 3 seconds, in a room full of species that had been navigating the galaxy for centuries longer than my own kind, was a very long time. My name is Mara Voss. I am 41 years old. I am 5 feet and 4 inches tall. I weigh just under 60 kilograms. I have short brown hair, unremarkable eyes the color of old wood, and I have been told on multiple occasions that I look like someone who would be easy to forget. I have always considered this a professional advantage. I was the first human delegate ever admitted to a full session of the Galactic Assembly of Sapiens, not the first human in space. We had been traveling the outer rim for 11 years by then, running survey ships and relay stations and small research outposts that the larger species politely ignored the way you might ignore a child drawing on the floor of a very important meeting. We were aware during those 11 years that we were being assessed. We were also aware that the assessment had not yet gone in our favor. The assembly chamber on Confluence was enormous in the way that things built for many different kinds of bodies tend to be enormous. Not elegant, not beautiful, but deeply functional. The ceiling was high enough for the winged Karathi. The floor textured in ways that accommodated a dozen different types of foot, paw, and lower appendage. The seating arrangements had been designed so that every species could observe every other species without effort. It was, in other words, a room built by intelligent beings who understood that the most important thing in a room full of potential rivals was visibility. I went straight to the back row. This was not assigned seating. The orientation session did not have assigned seating. It was the first gathering, an informal welcome briefing for all new delegates arriving for the current diplomatic cycle. There were no rules about where you sat. And so, in the way that people and non-people tend to sort themselves in a room without rules, each species or delegation had naturally clustered in the areas that felt most comfortable to their particular biology and social instinct. The Veth sat near the front left, which positioned them close to the 2 main exits. They were, as a species, exactly what their dossier described. Tall, chitinous, with narrow heads and eyes that could track motion at ranges that made most surveillance equipment unnecessary. They were what the Galactic Registry formally classified as a Tier 1 predator civilization, which was a polite way of saying that their planet's evolutionary history had been a long and very efficient argument about who got to eat whom, and the Veth had won that argument so completely that the losing side was no longer around to comment on the outcome. The Keth Saren sat together in a mid-left cluster, close to the low-light panels. Their homeworld orbited a dim star, and most of what they communicated to each other happened through subtle shifts in pupil dilation and coloration in the thin membrane beneath their outer eyelid. To watch them from across a room was to watch what looked, from the outside, like 6 extremely still creatures doing nothing. If you knew how to read them, which almost no one in this room did, they were talking quite rapidly about everything they were observing. I had been studying both species for 8 years. I sat down in the back row, set my bag under my chair, and took out my water thermos. It was a small, scratched, dark green thermos that I had carried on 4 research expeditions and 2 prior diplomatic postings, and it had a small dent on one side where I had dropped it on a metal floor in a hurry once. I poured myself a small amount of water. I looked at the room. The briefing had not yet started. The room was in that particular pre-session state where everybody was performing the version of themselves they wanted to be seen as. The Karathi delegates near the center of the room were doing elaborate and deliberate greeting rituals with their crest feathers raised. Communication that essentially meant we are important. We know you see us. Yes, you should be paying attention to us. The Drake cluster on the right side were doing nothing at all, which from the Drak was itself a form of communication. The Drak did not need to perform importance. The Drak massed between 400 and 600 kilograms each and had a recorded history of interstellar conflict that predated most of the other species in this room having developed written language. I watched all of this with the mild, quiet interest of someone who had spent most of her adult life in rooms where she was not the most important thing present and had learned to find this comfortable rather than troubling. It was during this pre-session period that I first noticed the scanning. The Veth near the front left were doing something that the literature on their behavioral patterns described as a resting threat map. It was not aggressive. It was not even entirely conscious, in the way that breathing is not entirely conscious. It was simply what Veth nervous systems did in a room containing multiple unknown entities. They built a real-time ranked list of what in the room needed to be watched most carefully. The physical tells were subtle. A very slight tilt of the head, a brief, precise movement of the eye ridge. The way the lead Veth's weight distributed fractionally differently on his seat every time his gaze arrived at a new subject and moved on. I had read about this behavior. I had studied it in observation recordings. I recognized it immediately. They started at the front of the room and worked outward. The Drake received a long, careful look, appropriate, given that the Drake were genuinely large and genuinely capable, and there was no evolutionary dishonesty in giving them full attention. The Karathi received a shorter look, threat assessment, moderate, noted and set aside. Several smaller species near the middle were scanned quickly and filed as low priority. The Kethsaran received a second look, because the Kethsaran were ambush specialists, and the Veth, themselves hunters, respected the particular danger of something that did not need to show itself to be lethal. Then the Veth lead scan reached the back row. I was looking at my notes, the scan passed me, moved on and this was the thing I noted carefully and did not react to, it came back. Not aggressively, not with alarm, just a return, a pause, a quiet recalibration of something that had not filed cleanly the first time. Like a good editor going back to a sentence that didn't quite read right. The Veth lead looked at me for approximately 2 full seconds, then moved on again. 6 minutes later he looked back again. Across the room, one of the Kethsaran had gone very still in a way that was different from their baseline stillness. I did not look directly at them. I knew better than to look directly at something that had just decided to pay attention to me. Instead, I used the peripheral vision that humans have, broad, motion sensitive, far better than most species assumed, to observe that the Kethsaran delegation had, quietly and without any fuss, reorganized their informal seating so that at least 2 of their number now had unobstructed lines of sight to the back row. To me, specifically, I took a sip of water. The briefing began. A tall coral-colored administrator of a species I did not immediately recognize addressed the room in the Assembly's common trade language, which I spoke at a functional level, and was working toward fluency in. The briefing covered logistics, meal cycles, communication protocols, the formal schedule for the coming diplomatic period, available mediation resources, standard orientation material. I took notes by hand, which was, I had learned itself, a form of communication in this kind of room. Species that recorded information digitally, which was most of them, noticed handwriting the way people notice someone doing something old-fashioned in an interesting place. It made me look studious and harmless and slightly behind the technological curve, all of which were images I was comfortable projecting. Midway through the briefing, the Veth who was seated 2 positions to my left shifted in his seat. He was not the lead Veth I had been observing. He was younger, smaller. Attaché, his registry profile had said, not a soldier or a security specialist. His name, in the Assembly's transliteration, rendered approximately as Severus. He had a researcher's build, if you could say that about a being made primarily of structured chitin and patience. He carried a data device rather than anything that looked like a weapon. He shifted in his seat, and the shift moved him approximately 4 centimeters further from me. He did not look at me. He did not make any gesture of acknowledgement or explanation. He simply redistributed his weight so that a small, precise amount of additional space existed between his body and mine. I noted this in my notebook, not in the notes section, in the margin, in the small handwriting I used for things I was still thinking about. The briefing ended. The room began to decompress into informal conversation and movement. I capped my pen, finished my water, and stood up to leave. As I walked to the exit, I was aware, the way you are aware of weather, or of the structural details of a new building, that I was being watched by at least 4 different sets of eyes, none of which belonged to another human. There were no other humans on Confluence Station. I was the only one. I thought about that as I walked back to my quarters, and I found to my own faint surprise that I did not find it lonely. I found it interesting. There is a particular quality to being the first of your kind somewhere, a sharpness, a heightened attention to everything, that most people describe as frightening but that I had always found, if anything, clarifying. Something in this room had decided I was worth watching. I was already watching back in my quarters. I opened my field journal, not the official one, the one I turned in copies of to the Foreign Affairs Office every 2 weeks, but the small leather one I had carried since my doctorate work, the one with the coffee stain on the inside back cover, and I wrote 3 lines. Veth scan return, twice within 6 minutes. Kethsaran sightline repositioning. Severus lateral displacement, 4 centimeters, no eye contact. I looked at those 3 lines for a moment. Then I wrote, underneath them, "They are not sure what I am." I closed the journal, set my alarm for the morning session, and went to sleep. I did not lie awake wondering what they thought of me. I did not feel anxiety about being alone, or watched, or unknown. I had been all 3 things before. I had been all 3 things in places far less comfortable than this, and in rooms far more actively hostile, and I was still here, taking notes in the margin, watching back. Outside my window, the stars of a system I could not yet name were cold and very far away, and the station turned slowly around its own axis. And somewhere in the corridors of Confluence, a Veth researcher named Severus was, I suspected, sitting with his data device and trying to figure out what the human bioscans actually meant. I hoped he had a good night. I rather suspected he did not. The next morning arrived the way mornings on rotating stations always arrive, not with light, but with a soft chime and the gentle pressure change as the ventilation system shifted from its night cycle to its day cycle. I lay still for exactly 90 seconds after the alarm, which was a habit I had developed not from laziness but from a conviction that the first 90 seconds of any day were best spent simply listening to whatever environment you were in before you started reacting to it. Confluence breathed. That was the only word I had for it. The station had its own low-frequency sound, a structural hum in the walls, a barely perceptible vibration in the floor. That was different from every ship and station I had been on before, older somehow, more settled. Like a building that had been stood in for so long it had developed its own rhythm. I got up, washed, dressed, and went to breakfast. The communal dining facilities on Confluence were organized, as everything on the station was organized, around the principle of radical accommodation. There were 7 separate food preparation areas, each calibrated to the nutritional and environmental requirements of different biological categories. The human nutritional requirements had been preloaded into the system 3 months ahead of my arrival, which I found both efficient and quietly touching. Someone, somewhere, had taken the time to make sure I could eat. I sat at a small table near the outer wall, where the viewport gave a clean look at the station's external ring. I ate, and I read, and I was, to all outward appearances, completely at ease. The Veth researcher Severus came in 20 minutes after me. He did not look at me. He collected his food. I did not let myself visibly observe what he ate, because direct observation of feeding behavior is considered a fairly pointed social statement in Veth culture, something between rudeness and a challenge, and sat at a table that was not near mine but was also not as far from mine as the room's layout would have easily allowed. The Kethsaran senior delegate, whose name I was still working out how to pronounce, came in shortly after and sat with the rest of the Kethsaran cluster. They ate in the communal way their culture preferred, food shared from central dishes, bodies angled slightly inward, but one of the junior delegates, without any apparent intention, had positioned himself so that his peripheral vision covered the table where I was sitting. I read my briefing documents and finished my meal and said nothing to anyone. And then something happened that I had not anticipated. The Galactic Assembly's standard orientation packet, issued to every new delegate upon arrival, included a xenobiological compatibility brief, a summary document providing each delegation with basic information about the other species present in the current diplomatic cycle. Its purpose was practical: to help delegates understand what behaviors might be accidentally offensive, what environmental needs required accommodation, and what basic physiological facts might matter for shared spaces and scheduling. I had not, until that morning, seen the version of this document that had been distributed about humans. I found it in my official inbox while eating breakfast. It had been sent to me by the Assembly's administrative coordinator, with a note that said only, "For your reference," as is standard practice for all attending delegates. I opened it. It was, as I said, technically accurate. Every single line of it was factually correct. This was what made it so interesting to read. It described the human species as bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, with a soft tissue exterior providing minimal natural protection against impact or environmental exposure. It noted that humans possessed a moderate sensory range, with visual acuity below the galactic average, hearing range narrower than most sapient species, and no electromagnetic or chemical sensing capabilities. It noted that humans required regular sleep cycles, consumed a wide variety of organic matter, maintained body temperature through an internal regulatory system, and had a reproductive cycle of approximately 9 months per offspring. It noted that humans showed moderate territorial behavior, moderate social bonding tendencies, and a documented history of intraspecies conflict over resources, ideology, and political organization. It classified us, in the Assembly's formal taxonomy, as non-apex generalists. Under threat potential, it read, low to moderate context-dependent, recommended social accommodation level, standard diplomatic protocols, no special precautions required. I read this document twice. Then I took out my field journal, the leather one, and I opened it to a clean page and I began to write. The document is correct, I wrote, in every single detail it chose to include. And this is exactly the problem with it. It had not mentioned our resting heart rate under high-stress conditions, which remains functional where most species' cardiovascular systems begin to compromise efficiency. It had not mentioned that humans are persistence hunters, one of the only species in the known biological record that evolved the capability to hunt prey not by being faster or stronger or better armed, but by simply not stopping, by moving at a pace that was sustainable for the human body almost indefinitely, and waiting for the prey to tire. The ecological niche that humans filled on their home planet was not that of a fast-strike predator, it was that of a horizon, something that appeared and kept appearing until the thing being followed ran out of options. It had not mentioned that human pain signaling, while functional and unpleasant, had been modulated by evolutionary pressure into a form that was, in practice, more information than instruction. Most species' pain responses were designed to produce immediate withdrawal from the painful stimulus. Human pain responses were designed to produce immediate assessment of the situation and a decision about whether withdrawal was currently possible or desirable. These were not the same thing. The difference in practice was that a human in pain very often continued doing what they were doing, because the pain was telling them something was wrong, not telling them to stop. It had not mentioned the domestication of apex predators. I paused on this one for a moment, because I always paused on this one, because it was the detail I found most impossible to fully explain to non-humans no matter how long I tried. At some point in the deep history of the human species, a group of humans had encountered a large territorial, pack-hunting carnivore, the wolf, and had, over a period of generations, formed a cooperative bond with it that eventually became what humans called the domestic dog. They had taken an apex predator and made it a companion, not a tool, not a controlled threat, a companion, something they lived alongside and fed and named and, in many documented cases, grieved when it died. They had then done this with a second species, and a third, and by the time humans reached the stars, they were a species with a documented history of looking at things that could have harmed them, and deciding instead to share space with those things and see what happened. The xenobiological brief had not included any of this. It had, very responsibly and accurately, noted that humans showed moderate social bonding tendencies. It had filed this under the category of in-group cooperative behavior, meaning that humans were good at working together with other humans. It had not extrapolated. It had not asked whether moderate social bonding tendencies, combined with a persistence hunting evolutionary background, combined with a history of taming apex predators, produced something that looked, from the outside, different from anything the taxonomy was built to accommodate. It had not asked what you got when you crossed the Carrer with the hunter, and let the resulting creature walk around the galaxy introducing itself as a diplomat. I finished writing and looked at what I had put down. Severus, I realized, had just gotten access to the same document I was holding, the same brief, the same accurate, incomplete, well-intentioned summary of what humans were. I wondered how long it would take him. I found out that evening. The Assembly ran a series of informal social sessions in the first week of every diplomatic cycle. Gatherings with no formal agenda, designed to let delegates from different species interact in a low-stakes environment before the actual negotiations began. The Assembly's logic was sound. Species that had shared a meal and made small talk were, statistically, better at reaching agreements than species that met each other for the first time across a formal table. The session that evening was held in a large, multi-environment common space on Deck 3. The lighting was adjustable by zone. The seating was varied and plentiful. There were conversation areas and quiet areas and a small open section near the center that was apparently used for presentations or demonstrations when delegates wanted to share something about their culture. I arrived at a moderate time, not first, not late. I found a spot that had a good view of the room and settled in. Severus was there. I saw him 20 minutes in, standing near one of the quieter zones with his data device in hand, and the expression that I had already come to recognize on him as thoughtful engagement. He was looking at something on the device. He looked up occasionally and scanned the room in that particular Veth way that was not quite a threat map, and not quite casual observation, but somewhere in between. His scan reached me. He did not look away immediately. This was different from the pattern of the previous day. I looked back at him without urgency. After a moment, he moved toward me with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it. He stopped at what would be, by the spatial norms of his culture, a conversational distance, farther than a human would typically stand. But I knew this, and I did not move toward him, he said, in the assembly's trade language. You are the human delegate I said that I was, he said. I have read the xenobiological brief on your species. I said that I had read it too. There was a brief silence. Severus had, I noticed, a very precise way of holding himself still when he was thinking, not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of active processing. It was a researcher's stillness. I recognized it because I sometimes looked the same way, he said. The document classifies you as non-apex generalists. I said that I was aware of that, he said. Our bioscans of your physiology do not support that classification. I felt something, not quite amusement, not quite satisfaction, but something in the neighborhood of both, settle quietly in my chest. I kept my expression neutral. I asked him what the scans showed instead. Severus looked at me for a moment with those forward-facing, high-acuity eyes that were built by evolution for tracking moving things at distance, and he said, they show a body in a calm phase following intense physical exertion, consistently, every scan, regardless of time of day or prior activity level. I waited, he said. The physiological signature is consistent with what our medical database categorizes as post-hunt settled state. In species with predatory evolutionary backgrounds, this state occurs after significant physical output, pursuit, conflict, exertion. The body reads as having recently completed something demanding. As being now at rest, he paused, he said. Your scans read this way all the time. The room around us was full of conversation and the particular social noise of many different kinds of beings being sociable. None of it touched this small, precise conversation happening near the wall. I said, I understand why that is confusing, he said. It is not confusing. It is alarming, I said. Then I should probably explain, he said very carefully. Please do so, I explained. I told him about the resting baseline of human physiology, the permanently active low-grade stress response, the cortisol management that kept us functional without shutting down, the dense connective tissue that every adult human carried as a record of what human bodies were built to do. I told him that humans did not have an equivalent of the post-hunt settled state, in the way he meant it, because humans did not have a between-hunt state in the biological sense. Human bodies did not reset to a pre-hunt baseline because the evolutionary environment that had shaped us had not allowed for extended rest periods. Between demands, we were always ready. Not because we were always hunting, but because the planet we came from had required us to be, for long enough that it had become structural. Severus was quiet for a long time after I finished saying this. Then he said slowly, so the classification of non-apex generalist is incorrect, I said. The classification is based on our behavior in a social and diplomatic context, which is genuinely non-aggressive and cooperative, said. We are not apex predators in the sense your taxonomy means. We do not function the way a Veth functions. We are not organized around the hunt the way your society historically was, he said. But your bodies are. I said yes. He looked at me, I said. Our bodies are built for a version of the world that doesn't quite exist anymore for us. But the build is still there. Severus stood with that researcher's stillness for what felt like a long time but was probably 12 seconds. Then he said, I would like to continue this conversation. There are several things I need to look up first, I said, of course. He moved away with the same deliberate pace he had arrived with. I watched him go, and I noticed that as he passed through the room, several other Veth who were present shifted their posture slightly. A subtle, involuntary recalibration. The kind that happens when a member of a group changes their own threat assessment and the others pick it up without being told. Severus had updated his model, the others had noticed. I turned back to the room. The Keth Saren delegate who had reorganized his sightline at breakfast was here too, standing with his group near the adjusted light zone. He had not approached me. He would not, tonight. The Keth Saren were more cautious in their social calibration than the Veth, more deliberate in how they changed their minds. But he was watching. They were all watching. I went to the quiet area near the viewport and sat down and looked at the stars for a while, and I thought about what Severus had said. Your bodies are built for a version of the world that doesn't quite exist anymore, and I decided I both agreed and disagreed with it in ways that would have taken a long time to explain to someone who had not grown up on Earth. Because the thing was, we had left that world, We had built ships and learned mathematics and developed medicine and written poetry and formed governments and all the rest of it. We had done everything that a species does when it graduates from surviving to building. We were, in every meaningful measure of civilization, not the same creatures that had run across dry plains after things that were faster and stronger than we were. But when you put us in a room with something unfamiliar, our bodies still remembered. They always remembered, and I thought, that is not a flaw. I had always thought it was not a flaw. It was just a fact, the way the shape of your hands is a fact, built by what your ancestors needed, not necessarily by what you need right now, but still yours, still functional, still in the right circumstances, exactly what was required. I finished my water. I went back to my quarters, and I wrote 3 more lines in my journal. Severus knows, Kithsaren watching, not yet ready to approach. Posture cascade among Veth group, update spreading. Then underneath, they are starting to understand. And then, because I was 41 years old, and I had been doing this kind of work for most of my adult life, and I had a decent sense of humor about my own situation, they don't look happy about it. I slept well. Outside, the station turned, and Confluence moved through space, and somewhere in it, a Vith researcher named Severus was sitting with his data device and a medical database, and I suspected he was not sleeping at all. It happened on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesdays meant anything on Confluence Station, where the timekeeping was calibrated to a standard cycle that bore no relationship to Earth's orbit. But I had kept my internal calendar, because I had kept my internal calendar through postings on 4 different stations and 2 planetary surfaces, and my internal calendar said Tuesday. So, it happened on a Tuesday. I was walking back from the Assembly's primary document archive on Deck 4. The archive was on the interior ring of the station, away from the viewports, and the corridors there were narrower than the main thoroughfares. Functional rather than designed for multi-species traffic, with the particular quality of secondary corridors everywhere, which is to say, they felt like the behind-the-scenes part of a building, rather than the part meant for visitors. I had been there for 3 hours, working through the historical record of the Assembly's first contact protocols, which I needed for a paper I was developing on diplomatic framing in multi-species contexts. The work had been slow and interesting, in the way that archival work is always slow and interesting, which is to say it was the kind of slow that you only notice when you finally stop. I left the archive at what my body told me was mid-afternoon and started back toward the main ring. I heard them before I saw them, not loudly, not the kind of sound you hear as footsteps or voices. More the way you hear the weight of people who are not trying to be heard, which is its own distinct sound if you have spent enough time in places where people sometimes tried not to be heard near you. A particular quality of presence in a corridor that should, by traffic patterns, have been mostly empty at this time of day. I did not change my pace. This was important. I had learned early that changing your pace, speeding up, slowing down, looking over your shoulder, told a room, or a corridor, or a street what you already knew. And I did not want to tell this corridor what I already knew. I turned the next corner, and there were 3 of them. Karathi delegates. I recognized the species immediately. The distinctive crest structure, the color patterns, the particular way their bodies distributed weight when they were not in a formal stance. These were not the senior Karathi officials who attended the assembly sessions. They were delegation staff, larger, less formally trained in diplomatic protocol, and currently arranged in the corridor in a way that left approximately 1 meter of open space between the one in the center and the wall behind me. The Karathi who stood in the center was not small. None of the Karathi were small. His crest was partially raised, a display behavior that the xenobiological literature on the Karathi described variously as intimidation signaling, dominance assertion, or pre-confrontation posturing, depending on which researcher you were reading. I stopped walking. I looked at the 3 of them with the same expression I would have used to examine a particularly dense passage in the archival documents. Mild, attentive, not urgent, I said, in the trade language. This is an interesting place to be standing. None of them said anything immediately. The center one's crest raised further, I said. I want to let you know that I first noticed you following me approximately 14 minutes ago. I counted 3 of you then. I count 3 of you now. This was true. I had noticed them at the second corridor junction past the archive entrance. A brief sound, a particular pattern of air movement that corridors produced when bodies were moving through them in an organized way. I had continued at my normal pace, turned where I was going to turn, and noted the continuation of the sound at each junction. 14 minutes, 3 individuals, a route that was converging on a low-traffic section of the interior ring. I had been waiting to see what they would do. The center one took a step forward. He was significantly taller than me. This was not unusual. Most of the species on Confluence were significantly taller than me. It was also not, by itself, a thing that changed anything about my assessment of the situation. I want to be very precise about what happened next, because I have told this story several times to people who expected it to be a dramatic story, and it is in fact a fairly quiet story, and the quietness of it is the thing that mattered most. The center Korathi lunged. It was fast. Their muscle response was rapid, and they had reached that exceeded mine by a considerable margin, and I was not where he expected me to be, because I moved at the beginning of the motion rather than the end of it, which required reading the intention from the shift in body weight, rather than waiting for the body to complete its decision, which was a thing I had been taught to do a long time ago on a cold, wet Tuesday morning in Edinburgh, by a woman named Caroline who had the smallest hands and the most efficient movement patterns I had ever seen, and who had told me, at the end of 8 months of training, that the most useful thing she could teach me was to answer the question that a body was asking before the body finished asking it. There was a brief exchange of positions in the corridor. Brief meaning approximately 3 seconds. At the end of those 3 seconds, the situation had rearranged itself in a way that was difficult to immediately describe, because the description would sound, from the outside, more dramatic than it felt from the inside. What I can say is this: no one was harmed. Nothing was broken. There was no significant noise. The only sound was the ventilation system and, briefly, the scuff of feet on the corridor floor. I was standing 2 steps to the left of where I had been standing. The center Korathi was not in the same position he had been in. The two on either side had not moved, because what had happened in a space and a time frame that had not, quite, resolved into the sequence of events they had been expecting. And beings, most beings, take a moment to update when the sequence they expected does not occur. I straightened the collar of my jacket. I looked at the three of them. I said, "I would like to go back to my quarters now." There was a silence. It lasted approximately 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a corridor where 3 beings have just found themselves in a position that none of their planning had produced. And then they let me go. I walked down the corridor at the same pace I had been walking before. I did not look back. Looking back would have communicated something I did not want to communicate. I walked at the pace of someone who had somewhere to be and was going there. I heard behind me none of the sounds that would have indicated pursuit. I heard the particular acoustic quality of a corridor with 3 beings standing in it who were not currently moving, which is its own kind of sound. I rounded the corner and continued toward the main ring. In my quarters, I made tea, a black tea that I had brought from Earth in a flat tin that I kept in the left compartment of my travel case, and I sat with the mug in both hands and let my body do what it needed to do, which was not very much. My hands were steady. My heart rate, as best I could gauge it without equipment, had elevated during the corridor and was now returning to what the bioscans would have registered as my normal baseline, which was to say the post-hunt settled state that had alarmed Severus at dinner. I drank my tea. I thought about Caroline, and the cold mornings in Edinburgh, and the way she had said, "You are not learning to fight. You are learning to have already decided, before anything happens, what you are willing to do and what the situation is likely to require. The technique is secondary. The decision is primary." I had made the decision a long time ago. The technique had just been the delivery mechanism. The next morning, I was aware, in the way you become aware of a change in the quality of light in a room, not through any single signal but through the aggregate of many small ones, that something had shifted on the station overnight. The assembly's social structure was not like a human organization. There were no memos, there was no announcement. No one gathered for a formal debrief or issued a statement. But species that have been navigating shared spaces for centuries have their own communication channels, and those channels are, in many ways, faster and more accurate than anything that gets written down. By the time I arrived at the morning session, the Veth who were present in the corridor outside the chamber had repositioned themselves in a way that was subtle and unmistakable. If you knew how Veth groups organized their spatial arrangement when their threat assessment of a shared environment had changed, they were not organized to watch me as a potential threat. They were organized in the way that experienced hunters organize themselves, around something whose category they have had to revise: more space, more attention, and none of the casual dismissal that had characterized the first day. The Keth Saren Jr. delegate, who had been maintaining peripheral sightlines for 3 days, now looked at me directly for the first time, not aggressively, not with alarm, with the specific quality of attention that I had come to understand meant, I have updated my assessment, and I am acknowledging the update. I nodded at him, briefly, the way you nod at someone in a corridor when you have recognized each other. He did not respond. Nodding was not part of Kethsaran communication, but he did not look away, and he did not perform the subtle repositioning that would have meant he wished to end the acknowledgement. I went to my seat. I took out my notes. I opened my thermos. Severus arrived 14 minutes into the session and sat without any apparent deliberation in the seat beside me. Not 2 seats away, not across the row. Beside me, he did not lean away. I looked at the front of the room where the session facilitator was arranging her materials, and I said without looking at Severus, "Good morning," he said in the trade language. "Good morning." There was a short silence. The session had not yet begun, Severus said quietly. "There was an incident on Deck 4 yesterday afternoon," I said. "There was," he said. "The corridor biosensors logged your biometrics during the incident," I said. "I was not surprised," he said. "Your readings did not significantly deviate from your standard baseline profile during the incident." I looked at the front of the room. I said, "No, they would not have." Another silence. The session facilitator called the room to attention, and the formal proceedings of the morning began, and Severus and I sat beside each other and listened. And after the first 20 minutes, during a brief procedural recess, he turned to me and said, in a tone that was as close to direct as I had heard from him, "You were not concerned." I thought about how to answer this honestly, I said. I was aware of the situation. I was attending to it. I would not describe what I experienced as concern in the way your species uses that word, he said. "Is that because you knew what you were going to do?" I said. "It is because I had already decided some time ago what I was willing to do if a situation like that one came up. The deciding had already happened in the moment. There was only the situation and the response." Severus was quiet for a long moment. The session was resuming. Before he turned back to the proceedings, he said, very softly, "Is this normal for humans?" I thought about Caroline. I thought about the tin of tea in my travel case. I thought about the 4 other postings before this one where I had sat in rooms where I was the smallest thing. Wise watched what happened, I said. "For the ones who do this kind of work, yes." He turned back to the front, so did I. The session resumed. The morning continued. Confluence turned in space, and somewhere in the station's security system, a log entry recorded the biometrics of one human delegate during a corridor incident on Deck 4. Unremarkable numbers, low deviation, standard baseline, and filed it. In the taxonomy it had been built to use as non-apex generalist, no special precautions required. And Severus sat beside me and said nothing more, and did not move away, and I thought the document will need updating eventually. But that is a conversation for another day. For now I had a session to attend, I had notes to take. I had a room full of the most sophisticated diplomatic minds in the known galaxy, and a good view of all of them from exactly where I was sitting. I took a sip of water and I paid attention. It was 2 days after the corridor incident, and Severus had been asking questions. Not in the way of an interrogation, not even technically in the way of a formal inquiry, though I had offered to submit to one if the assembly required it after the incident. The security committee had reviewed the corridor logs and found nothing that required formal action. The 3 Karathi staff members involved had, after a very quiet conversation with their senior delegation officials, submitted what the Assembly's protocols described as an informal acknowledgement of inappropriate conduct, which was the diplomatic equivalent of an apology dressed in formal language, and the matter had been officially set aside. But Severus had questions. He had a great many questions, and because he was a researcher by training and inclination, he was pursuing those questions with the particular organized persistence of someone who had found a problem that his existing frameworks could not cleanly solve. He came to my workspace on the morning of the 3rd day with his data device and a folder of documents and the expression of a being who had been up. For most of the night I had expected this. I had made an extra mug of tea. He looked at the mug on the low table between us and then looked at me, and I said, "I made enough for 2, though I am not certain if the flavor profile is compatible with vet biology." He looked at it for another moment, and then, with the careful deliberation of someone doing a thing they had decided to do in advance, sat down across from me and set his documents on the table. He said, "I would like to understand something." I said, "Of course," he said. "I have been reviewing the Earth biological record. The full record, not the summary provided in the assembly brief. I have been reading it since the evening of the corridor incident." I waited, he said. "The document the assembly uses classifies your species as moderate territorial aggression, moderate social bonding, low threat potential." I said, "Yes." He said, This classification is based on the behavioral profiles compiled during your species' first contact period with the galactic community. The behavioral profiles show human delegates engaging in cooperative, non-aggressive diplomatic conduct across all recorded interactions. I said. That is accurate, he said. But the biological record is, he stopped. He looked at his data device, he said. The biological record is something different, I said. Yes, he pulled up something on the device and turned it toward me. It was an entry from an Earth zoological archive. A description of long distance running as a hunting technique. The entry was dry and scientific, the way zoological descriptions always are. But I had read it before and I knew what it said. It said that early human hunters had the ability to maintain aerobic activity at a pace that, while slower than most prey animals over short distances, could be sustained for periods of hours without physiological compromise, while most quadruped prey animals could not sustain their top sprint speed for more than a short time before their core temperature rose to dangerous levels. It said that this technique, persistence hunting, worked because humans could outlast what they could not outrun, Severus said. This is documented. This was a real hunting method, I said. It was, yes, he said. And you still have the physiology for it, I said. The physiology is still there, yes. We do not use it the same way anymore. But I searched for the right word in the trade language and settled for, the capacity is still there. Severus put the data device down on the table. He looked at me in the way he looked at things he was actively processing. He said, let me make sure I understand what I am looking at. I said, please, he said. Your species evolved in an environment that required you to function as persistent pursuit hunters, with a physiology calibrated for extended high-exertion activity, rather than short-burst speed. You developed broad-spectrum social bonding, meaning you form cooperative bonds not only with members of your own species, but historically, with members of other species including predatory species. He looked at his notes. You have a documented tolerance for physical discomfort that most galactic species medical literature would classify as abnormal. Your nervous system manages acute stress responses in a way that maintains functional performance, rather than triggering withdrawal. And your species, he paused, domesticated apex predators. For companionship, I said yes, all of that is accurate. Severus was quiet for a moment. He said, and then you developed civilization, became a spacefaring species, joined the galactic community, and began attending diplomatic summits. I said yes, he said, and all of that, he gestured at the data device, is still in your body. I said yes, he said. While you were at the diplomatic summits, I said yes. He looked at me. Outside the viewport behind him, a slow cargo vessel was making its way toward the station's outer dock, drifting with the particular patient heaviness of something very large in very small gravity, Severus said. I need to tell you something in Veth culture. There is a concept. It does not translate well, but the nearest meaning in the trade language would be something like the controlled self. It describes a state of being in which a capable hunter, for reasons of culture or circumstance or choice, has decided to engage in cooperation rather than competition. It is considered, his word here was careful, it is considered the highest expression of social development in our society, the decision to come to the table rather than the hunt. He looked at his data device. He said, when I look at your biological record and I look at your behavior since you arrived on this station, that is what I see. A species that is built for one thing and has chosen to do another, I said. I think that is a generous interpretation, he said. It is an accurate interpretation. I am a scientist, not a diplomat. I try not to make interpretations that are not accurate. I thought about this. I thought about the 41 years of being Mara Voss, which included things like the 8 months with Caroline in Edinburgh, and 3 years on a survey relay in the Outer Rim where I had been the only human for 300 consecutive days, and a conversation with my father when I was 17 years old, in which he had asked me why I always wanted to go to the places that were furthest away, and I had said, because those are the places where you find out what things actually are, I said to Severus. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, I said. Why did the Veth threat scan keep returning to me in the orientation session, not the bioscanner? The actual individual Veth in the room, you, the lead delegate, the others. I noticed it on the first day, and I have been waiting for the right moment to ask. Severus looked at his data device for a moment. Then he looked up. He said, because you sat in the back row, I said. That's it, he said. Part of it. In Veth culture, and in the cultures of several other species in this assembly that developed from predatory evolutionary backgrounds, the back of a room is not where the non-threatening members of a group sit. The back of a room is where you sit when you want to see everything, when you want maximum information and minimum exposure. It is where you sit when you are prepared to move in any direction at any moment. It is the tactically dominant position in most enclosed spaces. I thought about this, I said. I sat there because I always sit in the back. I sat there because you can see the whole room from there. Severus said yes. I said I just wanted to watch what was happening. Severus said yes. And to the portion of every predator lineage brain in that room that processes spatial positioning before the conscious mind gets to it. What you communicated, by sitting in the back row and making no social noise and simply watching, was, I am something that knows where to sit. I was quiet for a moment, Severus said. We did not know what you were. The brief said one thing, your body said another. Your behavior said a third thing that matched the second thing more than the first. And when something does not fit the category, we look at it again. I said, I see, he said. And then you sat quietly for 3 days and attended every session with perfect diplomatic conduct and made careful notes and were, by every behavioral measure, exactly what the brief described. And then the corridor incident occurred and your biometrics did not change. I said no, he said, and that is when I stopped looking at the brief. We sat for a moment in the kind of silence that is not uncomfortable but is thinking. The cargo vessel outside the viewport had reached the outer dock and was beginning its slow rotation into the docking position. Severus said, there is a vote coming, I said. I know, he said. The Karathi faction has filed a formal objection to human admittance to the assembly. It will come to a full-floor vote on the last day of this diplomatic cycle, I said. I am aware, he said. I wanted to tell you that I will be reviewing the biological record you and I have been discussing, along with the corridor incident log and several other documents, with my full delegation before that vote. I looked at him. Severus. You do not need to, he said. I am a scientist. I update my assessments when my data changes. My data has changed. He picked up his data device and the folder he stood. Then he stopped and said, May I ask you something now? I said, Of course, he said. Are you ever, he paused, finding the word afraid, the physical kind of afraid, in the situations you have clearly been in, and the situations you will likely be in again doing this work, do you experience fear? I thought about this honestly. I thought about it the way I thought about most things, which was to wait until I had a real answer rather than a convenient one. I said, I am afraid of many things. I am afraid of not being good enough at what I am trying to do. I am afraid of losing the people I care about. I am afraid of making decisions that turn out to be wrong in ways that matter to someone. I said physical danger in the moment of it. No, not the way you mean. I know it is a problem. I assess it as a problem, and then I found the word handle it. The fear part does not occur to me as a separate event. Severus looked at me for a long, unreadable moment. Then he said, very quietly, that is what frightens us about your species, I said. Not what we can do, he said. What you can do is legible. It can be assessed and planned around, he said. What frightens us is that the space where the fear would be, in any other species, in any evolutionary history we have encountered, in humans that space is just problem-solving. He left. I sat with my tea and looked at the docked cargo vessel through the viewport and thought about what he had said for a long time. I did not arrive at any particularly clean conclusion, because the question Severus had put in front of me was one of those questions that does not have a clean answer. It has an honest answer, which is sometimes different. The honest answer was, I did not know exactly where the space where the fear should have been had gone. I had spent 41 years in that body, and I had never been able to find it. It was possible it had never been there the way it was there for other species. It was possible the evolutionary pressure that had produced human physiology had routed that particular response into something else, into the problem-solving, as Severus had said, into the calm baseline, into the post-hunt settled state that was never actually post-hunt because the hunt was never quite over, not in the deepest part of the machinery. I thought about Caroline in Edinburgh, saying, the decision is primary, the technique is secondary. I thought about my father asking, why do you always want to go to the places that are furthest away? And I thought about the answer I had given him, which was, because those are the places where you find out what things actually are, including, I supposed yourself. I finished my tea. I opened my notes for the afternoon session. I had a paper to finish, a set of documents to review, and a diplomatic cycle that was moving toward its final vote. I had work to do. The vote was scheduled for the last full day of the cycle. By the morning of that day, I had been on Confluence Station for 19 days, which was not a long time by the standards of most diplomatic processes, but was, by the particular measure of what had happened in those 19 days, a very full 19 days. The Karathi faction's formal objection brief had been distributed to all delegations 4 days earlier. It was a well-written document. I read it 3 times, It was built on three main arguments. First, that humanity was too recently encountered to be adequately assessed for the purposes of full assembly membership. Second, that the incident on Deck 4 demonstrated an unpredictability in human behavior that was incompatible with the assembly's standards. And third, that admitting a species classified as non-apex generalists created a precedent for what they described as premature species elevation. The third argument was the most interesting to me because it was, of the three, the most honest about what was actually being argued. The first two were concerns that could theoretically be addressed. The third was something different. The third was, we are not sure what category you belong in, and that uncertainty is itself the problem. I had spent the 4 days since the brief's distribution doing what I had come here to do, which was my job. I attended sessions. I submitted commentary on 2 procedural proposals. I filed a paper on first contact linguistic framing that the Assembly's academic committee had accepted for their internal journal. I ate my meals and took my notes and sat in the back row of every session I attended. Severus had, in those 4 days, done a great deal of talking with his delegation. I did not know the content of those conversations. I had not asked and had not been told, but I watched the aggregate body language of the VETH delegation over those 4 days the way I had been watching bodies since I was old enough to understand that bodies told you things that words were still deciding whether to say, and what I saw was a delegation working through a significant revision of something they had previously believed to be settled. The Keth Saren senior delegate had on the 3rd day approached me directly for the first time. He stood at what was a carefully calibrated middle distance. Not the VETH conversational distance, not the standard human conversational distance, but a considered point somewhere in between, which meant he had looked up human spatial norms before coming to talk to me, which meant this conversation had been planned. His name, in transliteration, was something that my mouth was not built to pronounce correctly, but the Assembly's social accommodation guidelines provided a shortened form that I was told was acceptable. He told me to call him Kevrin. Kevrin said very little. The Keth Saren cultural tradition of low verbal communication meant that what he said had been selected for precision rather than for warmth. He said, "We have reviewed the available records on your species," he said. "We would like to understand more about the decision-making framework you applied during the corridor incident," he said. Specifically, whether that framework represents individual psychology or species-level characteristic. I said, "My best honest answer is both, but weighted towards species level. The specific training I had is individual, but the underlying framework, what I described to Severus as having already decided in advance, that is something most adult humans who operate in high variability environments develop. The training makes it faster. The underlying capacity is generally human." Kevin was quiet for what felt like a careful amount of time. He said, "We appreciate the honesty," I said. "The Keth Saren reputation for precise communication makes honesty feel like the appropriate register." He regarded me, and I say regarded because there was a quality to the way Keth Saren looked at things that was distinct from how most species looked at things, a completeness of attention that felt like being very carefully read. And then he did something I did not expect. He dilated. Not his pupils in the normal sense. The thin membrane beneath his outer eyelid shifted through a sequence of colors so quickly that I very nearly missed it. But I had read the Keth Saren behavioral literature for 8 years, and I had been watching him for 19 days, and I caught it. It was the Keth Saren expression for, "This being is more than it appears to be," and I have updated my record accordingly, I said. "Thank you for the conversation, Kevin." He inclined his head and moved away. The morning of the vote arrived clear and fast, the way endings often do. Not with fanfare but with a kind of density, the sense of many threads of time converging. I woke before my alarm and lay still for my 90 seconds of listening. And what I heard was the station doing its normal things, breathing and turning. And I thought, this is what I came here for. I dressed carefully. Not elaborately. I was not a person who owned elaborate clothes, but deliberately. I wore the outfit I had decided on 2 days earlier. Clean, understated professional. The kind of clothes that said, "I take this seriously without saying I am trying to impress you." I had learned to make that distinction. The assembly chamber was full. Every delegation was present. This was unusual. Full attendance at a vote of this type was not required, and not all species valued physical presence over remote participation. But they were here, all of them. I went to the back row. Severus was already there. He had left the seat beside him open. I sat down. We did not say anything to each other. We did not need to. The session began with a formal reading of the Karathi objection brief. Standard. Procedure. providing the objecting party their full statement before the floor opened. The lead Korathi delegate read it with the careful neutrality that the assembly's protocols required, neither with passion nor with hostility, just the words in the correct order. The brief was exactly as I had read it. It said what it said. Then the session chair asked if any delegation wished to speak before the vote was called. There was a pause of the kind that happens in rooms when no one is quite certain who should speak first. And then, the session chair looked at me. Not at my delegation, because I was my delegation. Just at me, alone in the back row with Severus beside me and the whole room in front of me, and said, "Delegate Vos, as the subject of the motion before the assembly, you are entitled to address the floor." I stood up. I want to tell this part carefully, because when I have told it before, people want to hear about a speech. People want to hear the words that change the room, and I understand why. It is a good story framework, the speech that wins the day. But what happened at the front of the assembly chamber was not quite a speech. It was something else. I walked to the floor podium. The room was quiet, with the quality of quiet that exists in rooms where many different nervous systems are all paying full attention, each in their own way. The Veth were alert and still. The Kethsaran had their complete quality of attention engaged. The Korathi were watching with the particular watchfulness of a delegation that has made an argument and is waiting to see it answered. I stood at the podium. I did not begin speaking. I stood there for 30 seconds, not because I was gathering myself, not because I was nervous. I was not nervous. I was attending to the room, reading it the way I had been reading rooms for 41 years, not dramatically, not with any kind of visible performance of attention, just quietly seeing what was there. And what was there was a room full of sapient beings, each of whom had traveled significant distances and invested significant effort into being in this place for reasons that had to do with wanting their species to have a voice in what the galaxy was building, each of whom had a history and culture and a set of fears and hopes that were, in their specifics, different from mine, and in their broad architecture, quite recognizable. The bioscanner would have read my biometrics during those 30 seconds and found nothing remarkable. Steady, calm, present, I said. I am not going to argue that humanity is not a young spacefaring species. We are. I am not going to argue that the incident on Deck 4 did not happen. It did, I said. What I want to tell you is something about what it feels like to be my species. Because I think the document you have been given does not quite capture it, I said. We come from a planet that was trying to end us for a very long time. Not personally, not with intention. Just through the normal operation of a world where resources were limited and competition for them was constant. And the particular evolutionary niche we occupied required us to be in every moment aware that we could be lost. We learned to run when things chased us. We learned to run after things when we needed to. We learned to stay very still when stillness was what the situation required. And we learned to move very quickly when it was not, I said. We also learned to sit with each other in the dark and tell stories. We learned to help strangers. We learned to remember our dead. We learned to look at things that could harm us and ask, sometimes, whether they would like to be something other than our enemies instead. I paused. I said, I know you have been watching me since I arrived. I know the bioscans read as something that does not fit neatly into your taxonomy. I know the corridor incident on Deck 4 looked, from the outside, like evidence of something unpredictable. I want to tell you what it actually was. I said it was a human who had been working in difficult places for a long time, doing the thing that humans who work in difficult places learn to do, which is, stay calm. Be present, handle the situation, and then go back to work, I said. We are not fearless. I want to be precise about this because fearless sounds heroic, and that is not what I mean. We are not fearless. We are afraid of all the things worth being afraid of failing the people we are responsible to, of missing the things that matter, of building something and watching it come undone. We feel all of that in full, I said. We are simply also very good at going anyway. I looked at the room, I said. Humanity would like to be part of what you are building here, not because we have proven ourselves in every way that a longer history might provide, but because we are here, and we are paying attention, and when it has been required of us, we have shown up. I said that is all I have. I walked back to my seat. The room was quiet for the particular duration of time, that rooms are quiet when something that cannot be immediately categorized has just occurred, not a long silence, not a dramatic one. Just the brief adjustment of many minds taking in something new and deciding what it meant. Then the session chair called the vote. The Veth delegation voted yes, all 7 of them, in the formal collective manner of Veth group decision-making, not a count of individual hands, but the synchronized posture shift that indicated unified position. I had read about this, I had never seen it in person. It was one of the most efficient expressions of group consensus I had ever witnessed. The Keth Saren delegation voted yes. The Drac, who had said very little during the entire 19-day cycle and whose internal deliberations were opaque to me, voted yes without ceremony. Several mid-tier delegations who had been listed as likely abstentions voted yes. The Karuthi delegation voted no. This was expected. The vote was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. The motion carried. Humanity was admitted to the Galactic Assembly of Sapients. The chamber did not erupt. It was a diplomatic chamber, not an arena, and the beings in it understood that the expression of strong emotion in formal assembly proceedings was an imposition on everyone who did not share your emotional register. So there was no eruption, but something happened. Something quiet and real and unmistakable to me, who had been watching bodies for 41 years. Every predator lineage delegate in the room tracked my movement as I walked back to my seat, not with threat assessment, not with the nervous, repeated scanning of the first day, with something that took me a moment to correctly identify, because I had not expected it from this particular direction. It was recognition, not friendliness, not warmth, something more foundational than that. The acknowledgement, from one kind of being that knows how to read a room to another kind of being that knows how to read a room. Yes, you are what you appeared to be. I sat down. I took out my water thermos. I poured a small amount of water into the cup and drank it. Severus, beside me, said nothing, but he was settled in a way he had not been at the beginning of the cycle. Easy in his seat, oriented toward the proceedings at the front of the room, no longer doing the involuntary fractional repositioning that had first told me, on day one, that something in his nervous system was uncertain about what I was. The session continued. Procedural matters were addressed. Timelines were established. Documentation was prepared and distributed in the quiet, organized way that professional assemblies of every species handle the administrative work that holds decisions together. I took notes. I listened to the proceedings. I did what I was here to do at the end of the session. As the room began to move into the informal close of a concluded cycle, Kevrin of the Keth Saren passed by the back row on his way out and paused, for exactly long enough to look at me with that reading quality of attention. Then he did the membrane shift, the one I had seen before, in our conversation, the one that meant, I have updated my record. This time, the sequence was slightly different. I did not know enough of the Keth Saren language to be certain of the full meaning, but I had read enough of the behavioral literature to believe it translated to something close to the record is complete, I thought. Not quite yet. We are just at the beginning, but I did not say this. I inclined my head in the way that the Assembly's multicultural protocol guide suggested was the safest general acknowledgement gesture across species, and he moved on. The chamber was nearly empty when I finally gathered my notes and capped my pen and put my thermos back in my bag. The low ambient lighting of the evening cycle had begun to ease in. Outside the viewports, the stars of this unnamed system were doing what they always did, which was nothing, which was everything. Severus was still there. He had not been in a hurry to leave, which I had also not been, and so we were among the last in the chamber as it settled into its quiet end of day. State, he said. Day one. I looked at him. He said, that is the translation, approximately, of what we say after a significant event that is also a beginning. The thing behind you is what it is. The thing ahead is what matters. I thought about that. Day one, he said. Yes. I looked at the front of the chamber, the podium, the session chair's empty table, the broad concentric arrangement of seating built to hold the full range of beings that the galaxy had assembled in this place. I opened my field journal to a new page. At the top I wrote Day one. I looked at those two words for a moment. Then I closed the journal and put it in my bag. Severus stood. I stood. We walked toward the exit together, at the comfortable pace of two people who had somewhere to be, but were not in a hurry to get there, which was its own kind of statement, and we both knew it. In the corridor outside, Confluence was doing its normal things. The hum of the ventilation, the soft percussion of the station's ongoing life. Beings moving between tasks in the particular purposeful way of beings who had important work in progress. We walked through it, and the corridor felt, I thought, like what it had always been. A place in the middle of things, built for passage, full of the going and coming of beings who were here for reasons that mattered to them. I was one of those beings now. Officially and formally, and on the record, I thought about the back row, and the watching, and the 30 seconds of silence at the podium, and Caroline in Edinburgh on a cold Tuesday morning, and my father asking why I always went to the furthest places. Because those are the places where you find out what things actually are. Including this, including here. including the particular quality of walking through a corridor on a rotating station in an unnamed system with a Veth researcher beside me and 19 days of something new behind me and everything else ahead. I put my bag over my shoulder, and I walked, and the station breathed around me, and I was, in the precise and honest sense of the word, exactly where I intended to be.